Hello. Now we are going to talk about creating attributes at runtime. We have already discussed about that. We can add an attribute to the instance at a runtime, right? And again, like if you add any attribute to the instance, that affect that specific instance only. So let's see that in Excel. Here we are creating a class called person. We have the two objects, P1 and the P2, and now we are adding the name attribute as an Alex to the P1. We can check P1.dict. It has the attribute. P2.dict is empty because this attribute has not been added to P2 the object to P2 object, and that's the reason it has not been affected, right? Now, so what happens if we add a functions as an attribute to our instance directly, right? So remember that if we add a function to the class itself, calling that function from the instance will result as in a method. So like when we add a function to the class, then we call that function to the instance, that function will become a method. But here we are not adding the function to the class. Here we are talking about adding the functions directly to the instance only, not the class. Let's see that. Here we're saying that p1 dot say hello, and now this is the lambda function now. So this is like adding the function. When we say p1 dot dict, it says that it has added a say hello as an attribute, and the value is a function, right? When we say p1 dot say hello, it will say that it is a function now. As you can see, that attribute is very simple functions, right? It is not attributed, it is not interpreted as a method, right? So when we call p1 dot say hello, when we call this just like a method, it explain what it says, right? We are able to run that function, right? Now, but when we say, like again, but this p2.dict has not been affected anymore. It is still null, right? So the question becomes is, can we create a method which is specific to the instance? Now we know how to attach function to specific to the instance, but can we create any method which is specific to that specific instance only? And the answer is yes, right? We have to tell explicitly Python that we are setting up a method to that specific instance only. And to do that, we have to create a method type object. So to create a method, we need to have a method type object. For that, we have to import the method type class. Here we are importing the method type class from the types. Let's import it. Now let's see that here we have the function. This init function is been defining in the person class. Here we are creating a two object, P1 and the P2, Eric and Alex, right? Now let's create a method object and bind it to a P1 object. First, we we create a function that will handle the bound object as its first argument, right? So here we are creating a function called say hello. It it has access to self. Now we are accessing self.name say hello. So it is a simple function. We can use this function directly, which has the name attribute. So P1 and the P2 both has the name attribute as a value. We can directly call this as a function, say hello P1, say hello P2. It explain what it says, right? Eric say hello and Alex say hello. Now we are going to create a method using this, which is bound to the P1 specifically. Now to convert this function into a method, we need to use this method type. So here we are using method type, and now we are passing this as a function over here, and now we are saying P1. So we are saying that we want to bound this function to the P1 object, right? And now we are giving as a different name over here. Let's see that. Now we see that bound method say hello, right? Now we see that it is a object. So this say hello is a method object bound to this object. This is what it says, right? But the question is, can we see that method is bound to the instance P1? So how do we call it? So as we know, right? So this P1 say hello is a method. But when we try to call this p1.p1 say hello, we are getting error. We are getting person object has no attribute p1 say hello. This means that it it's this our person class see this object, see this method as an attribute, and it has to be an attribute. Then only it will work, right? So all you need is to add this method to the instance dictionary, right? If we add this method is not, this method is bound to the object, but it is not in the instance dictionary. If we do so, then we can achieve the same task, right? Now we are saying p1 dot say hello equal to p1 say. So now we are attaching this method to say hello attribute. Now when we do so, and after that when we call p1.dict, now we say that, now we see that the say hello is the attribute name, and this attribute is a method now, right? Now we try to call it when we say p1.say hello. Now we are able to call it. So even though if you have the method or the function, it has to be attached as an attribute. We can also it can also work with the getAttr function when we call this getAttr p1 and then we say hello. So it will access this say hello as an attribute, and now we are calling at the same time. So it will call the method. We can also look at the dict, but again here this p2 has not been affected. So when we say p2.dict, it's empty. So it still has this one property name and the value is Alex, right? So to create a bound method after the object has been initialized, we need to create a bound. We just create a bound method and add it to the instance itself, right? We can do it this way, right? So here we have this p1 as a person. We can say the p1.dict, it is just name. We can simply say p1.say hello method type, and now we are defining a method, and now the self is a reference to the p1, and that's it. We have this say hello method now attached to the specific p1, attached to the specific object, right? But we can also do this from any instance method too, right? Examples, here we are seeing some examples. So what we want to see is, here suppose we want some class to have some functionality. Here's a class that is called the same way but with a different from instance to instance, right? So we want to register a method that work different with a different object, right? So here is what we can do. So here first we are importing the method type, we are initializing the persons. Now we are defining a register do work which takes the object and takes the function itself. Now it's set that attribute to this object, to whatever object it will pass. The attribute name would be do work and the value would be the method. So whatever the function it is, it has been converted to a method to the self object. Now here we have this another method called do work. Now when we run this do work, it will says that it will first try to access the attribute do work for that object, right? If that is available, then like if the attribute is available, then it will give, otherwise it will return you the default value which is none. So do work method will be defined based on whatever the value we have with this do work. And if we are checking that if the do work is none, if the do work is present, so we have to call it, otherwise we have to raise the attribute error, right? So let's see that here we are getting the two attribute, two object, math teacher and the English teacher both are the person. Now first try to call the do work over here. Now here remember we have not registered any object, here we have not registered any method, right? So but before that when we try to call the do work, we'll get that exception error. Here we can see that you must first register a do work method. Now let's create a function over here, math work. Now we want to register this math work as a function. For that we have defined a function called register do work. We are calling this math teacher dot register do work. We are passing the functions, right? And now this will set the math work functionality as a do work over here. So the name would be do work, but but on the other hand, right, this function behave like a method. When we call math teacher.dict, now we can see that we have the do work as an attribute name, and this is the method we have as a work math. Now we can call the do work directly. Now when we call the do work over here, when we call this function, right, this method, it will access the do work and it will give you the output. See this? Now here we are defining our new work for the English teacher. We are saying work English. Again, the same thing we are doing, right? So here it is just like a plug and play, right? We have defined. Now for English, this is the different output. And for math, this is the different output. Can you see this? So the same method, but behaving differently because this function has been defined, or like this function has been defined as a method, right? Differently and bound to the each instance, right? This is how we create attribute at runtime. Right? Thank you very much.